September 19th, 1944. The French countryside near Arracourt was covered in morning fog so thick you couldn't see 20 yards in any direction. And Sergeant Nicholas Mashlonik sat in his Sherman tank commander's seat listening to the rumble of German engines somewhere out there in that grey wall of mist. He was 24 years old, a kid from Pennsylvania who'd been commanding this 30-ton Sherman for the 4th Armored Division. And he knew what everyone back at headquarters whispered about his tank. Outdated. Outgunned. A death trap on tracks. The Germans had Panthers now, massive 50-ton monsters with armor so thick that American shells just bounced off like pebbles hitting a brick wall. And those 75mm guns on the Panthers could punch through a Sherman's armor from over a mile away. Mashlonik's crew had painted a nickname on their tank's barrel, but it didn't change the math. On paper, his Sherman was obsolete. The fog started lifting around 8 in the morning, and that's when Mashlonik saw them. 6 German Panther tanks rolled across the field in a perfect wedge formation, their long guns tracking left and right as they searched for targets. They looked invincible. They were supposed to be invincible. Every intelligence report, every training manual, every briefing from division command said the same thing. If you see a Panther, you call for backup, you find cover, you do not engage head-on because that's suicide. But Mashlonik didn't have time for backup, and there wasn't any cover. And those Panthers were heading straight for the American supply lines that kept the entire 4th Armored Division moving forward. His gunner, a 20-year-old kid from Texas named Bobby Chen, looked up at him with wide eyes and asked if they should pull back. Mashlonik shook his head. They were staying. And here's the thing. This day becomes one of the most insane tank battles in American history. So hit that subscribe button because we tell stories like this every single week at WW2 Vault. And you're going to want to see what happens next. What those German Panther commanders didn't know was that Mashlonik had spent the last 3 months learning everything wrong with their supposedly perfect tanks. And he was about to teach them a lesson they'd never forget. This wasn't going to be the easy victory the Germans expected. This was going to be a masterclass in how to kill a giant. The Germans had good reason to be confident because their Panther tank was genuinely superior in almost every measurable way. The Panther's frontal armor was 4.5 inches thick, sloped at an angle that made it even stronger, while the Sherman's armor was barely 2 inches and flat as a barn door. The Panther's 75mm gun could penetrate 5 inches of armor at 1,000 yards. But the Sherman's gun could barely scratch 3 inches at the same distance. German tank crews called Shermans Tommy Cookers because they caught fire so easily, burning their crews alive when the ammunition stored inside ignited from a penetrating shot. Panther commanders had standing orders to engage Shermans on sight because it was supposed to be target practice, and German training films showed Panthers destroying Shermans with single shots from ranges where the American tanks couldn't even fire back effectively. At Arracourt, the Germans had brought 262 tanks to fight against the Americans' 154, giving them nearly a 2-to-1 advantage in numbers on top of their already superior equipment. The 5th Panzer Army had been rebuilt after its losses in Normandy, and German officers told their crews this would be over in a day, maybe 2 at most. The math was simple. The Panthers were better. The Germans had more tanks. The Americans were going to be pushed back across the Moselle River. And then the Wehrmacht would have breathing room to establish a new defensive line. This was going to be a massacre, and every German tank commander rolling toward Arracourt that morning believed they were about to hand the Americans their worst defeat since Kasserine Pass back in 1943. But the Germans had made a fatal assumption. They thought American tank crews would fight the same way they had 6 months ago in Normandy, cautiously and by the book, respecting the Panther's superior specs and trying to avoid direct engagement. What the Germans didn't know was that the American tankers had been learning, adapting, and getting angrier with every Sherman that burned and every crew that died. The 4th Armored Division wasn't the same unit that had landed in France. They'd been fighting and bleeding and learning hard lessons for 3 months straight, and they'd figured out something the German High Command refused to believe. You could kill a Panther if you were willing to get close and fight dirty. Mashlonik knew something the German tank commanders were about to learn the hard way. The Panther had a weakness, and if you were smart enough and fast enough and brave enough, you could exploit it. The Panther's thick frontal armor made it nearly invincible from the front, But that heavy armor made the tank slow to turn, and the Germans had designed their transmission system so poorly that it broke down constantly under the weight of all that steel. The Panther's side armor was only 2 inches thick, barely stronger than the Sherman's frontal plate, and the engine compartment in the rear was even weaker with armor that couldn't stop a well-placed Sherman round. American tank crews had figured this out the hard way through dozens of engagements where Shermans got slaughtered trying to fight Panthers head-on. But the crews who survived learned a brutal truth. You don't fight a Panther like a duel at high noon. You fight it like a street fight where the guy who moves fastest and hits from the side wins every time. The problem was that getting to a Panther's side or rear meant closing the distance, moving into kill range where one German shot could end everything, and most Sherman crews weren't willing to take that risk. But Mashlonik was different. He'd grown up hunting in the Pennsylvania woods where you learned that a deer with better senses and faster legs could still be brought down if you were patient and smart about your approach. He drilled his crew relentlessly on speed and coordination until they could reload and fire in under 6 seconds, which was twice as fast as most German crews could manage in their Panthers. He'd studied after-action reports from every Sherman versus Panther engagement he could find, looking for patterns and weaknesses. He'd even talked to crews who'd survived encounters with Panthers, asking them what worked and what got you killed. The Sherman might have a weaker gun, but it could shoot more often, and it could move faster and turn quicker than the lumbering German tanks. The Sherman had a lower profile that made it easier to hide and harder to spot at distance. The Sherman's engine was more reliable, its transmission tougher, and its crew compartment better designed for communication and coordination under fire. These advantages didn't show up in the spec sheets that compared armor thickness and gun penetration, but they mattered in actual combat where battles were won by whoever could react faster and adapt quicker to chaos. When those 6 Panthers came rolling through the fog that morning, their commanders were following standard German doctrine: advance in formation, use your superior range to engage targets, and rely on your frontal armor to shrug off return fire. It was the same tactic that had worked against Polish cavalry in 1939, against French tanks in 1940, and against Soviet armor in 1941 and 1942. The Germans had been winning with these tactics for 5 years, and they saw no reason to change what worked. But Mashlonik didn't try to fight them head-on. He ordered his driver to go full speed to the right, putting the Sherman into a flanking position while the Panthers were still trying to figure out where the American tank had gone. The Germans had been trained to fight in formation, to use their superior frontal armor and long-range guns to dominate the battlefield from distance. But Mashlonik threw out every rule in the book and turned the fight into chaos. His driver pushed the Sherman to 25 miles per hour, racing across uneven ground while Mashlonik stood in the commander's cupola tracking the Panthers through his binoculars. The German tanks were still in their wedge formation, still scanning for targets to their front, still expecting the Americans to fight the way they always had. They weren't ready for a Sherman that came at them from the side like a predator going for the throat. His first shot hit a Panther in the side at 300 yards, and the German tank exploded so violently that pieces of its turret flew 50 feet into the air. The kill was clean and instant because Mashlonik's gunner had aimed for the ammunition storage along the Panther's hull, and when the American shell penetrated, every round inside that German tank detonated at once. The other 5 Panthers tried to turn to face this new threat, but their heavy weight and mechanical issues meant turning took time, precious seconds where they were vulnerable. Mashlonik's driver was already moving, racing to a new position while the German tanks were still rotating their turrets. His second shot caught another Panther in the engine compartment, and black smoke started pouring out as the German crew bailed out and ran for cover. 3 minutes into the fight, Mashlonik had destroyed 2 Panthers, and the remaining 4 German commanders were starting to panic because nothing in their training had prepared them for a Sherman that fought like this. The German radio traffic was frantic now, commanders shouting coordinates and trying to locate the American tank that had just killed 2 of their own. One Panther fired at where Mashlonik had been 30 seconds ago, the shell screaming past and hitting nothing but dirt. Another tried to back up and create distance, but the Panther's slow reverse speed made it an easy target. Mashlonik's third shot hit that backing Panther right in its side armor, punching through and starting a fire that forced the crew to evacuate. 3 down. 3 to go. and it had been less than 5 minutes. The remaining 3 Panthers finally broke formation and started moving independently, each trying to find cover and regroup. This was exactly what Mashlonik wanted because separated Panthers were easier to pick off than Panthers working together. He radioed his position to other American tanks in the area, calling for support and making sure no other Shermans accidentally shot at him in the confusion. Then he went hunting. His driver knew the terrain around Arracourt from previous reconnaissance, and they used every fold in the ground, every tree line, every stone wall to stay hidden while closing distance on the scattered German tanks. The 4th Panther died behind a small ridge where its commander thought he was safe. Mashlonik's Sherman came over that ridge at full speed, fired at point-blank range into the Panther's rear armor, and disappeared back down the slope before the German crew even knew what hit them. The 5th Panther tried to make a run for the tree line, but Mashlonik cut it off and put 2 rounds into its side while it was moving. The Panther ground to a halt with smoke pouring from every hatch, another victim of the Sherman's superior mobility and rate of fire. The 6th and final Panther was the hardest kill because its commander was smart and had found a good defensive position behind a stone farmhouse where his frontal armor faced the only approach. Mashlonik circled wide, taking almost 20 minutes to get into position, using buildings and trees to stay hidden while he maneuvered. His crew was exhausted, soaked in sweat from the heat inside the tank and the adrenaline of sustained combat. But they'd come this far, and Mashlonik wasn't about to let the last Panther escape. He finally got the angle he needed, a narrow window where the Panther's side was exposed for maybe 3 feet. His gunner took the shot. The shell went through that tiny gap and hit the Panther's ammunition storage. The explosion was so big it collapsed part of the farmhouse. The battle lasted 8 hours total, and Mashlonik destroyed all 6 Panthers without taking a single hit. He'd move, shoot, relocate before the Germans could return fire, and then do it again, turning his supposedly inferior Sherman into a ghost that appeared from unexpected angles and disappeared before the Panthers could respond. German after-action reports from Arracourt mentioned American tanks that seemed to be everywhere at once, moving faster than should be possible, hitting weak points with precision that suggested the Americans had somehow learned all of the Panther's vulnerabilities. Some German commanders claimed the Americans must have had new tanks, special models with better guns, because they refused to believe standard Shermans could do this much damage. But Mashlonik's Sherman was completely standard. Same armor, same gun, same engine. The only difference was the crew inside and the tactics they used. By the time the sun set on September 19th, the entire Arracourt battlefield looked like a graveyard for German armor. Dozens of Panthers sat burning or abandoned, their long guns pointing uselessly at the sky while American tanks rolled past them heading east. The Americans had destroyed 281 German tanks in 3 days of fighting while losing only 25 Shermans. And it wasn't because the Sherman was suddenly a better tank than the Panther. It was because American commanders like Mashlonik had figured out that tactics mattered more than armor thickness, that speed and training and pure aggressive determination could overcome what looked like impossible odds on paper. The Germans had brought their best equipment and their most experienced crews, and they'd lost anyway because they couldn't adapt to how the Americans were fighting. Mashlonik's success wasn't unique at Arracourt. Other Sherman commanders were racking up similar kill counts using the same aggressive flanking tactics, the same refusal to respect the Panthers' supposed invincibility. The 4th Armored Division had created a culture where crews competed to see who could kill the most German tanks, where innovation was encouraged and rigid doctrine was thrown out when it didn't work. This was the opposite of how the German army operated with its strict hierarchy and by-the-book training that left no room for individual initiative. The Americans were learning faster than the Germans could adapt, and Arracourt proved it. After the battle, intelligence officers interviewed Mashlonik trying to understand his tactics so they could teach other crews. He told them it was simple. Treat every fight like the Panther is a dangerous animal that's stronger than you but slower and dumber. Then use your speed and brains to kill it before it kills you. Don't fight fair. Don't respect the rules. Do whatever works. The officers wrote down his advice and distributed it throughout Third Army, and Sherman crews started using Mashlonik's tactics across the entire front. German Panther losses started climbing even faster. Mashlonik survived the war and went home to Pennsylvania, where he worked as a machinist and raised a family and never talked much about his time in France. Years later, when historians asked him how he'd managed to destroy 6 Panthers in 8 hours with a tank everyone said was obsolete, he gave an answer that summed up everything the Germans had failed to understand. He said the Sherman wasn't the best tank in the war, but it was good enough, and good enough was all you needed when you had better training, better tactics, and crews who refused to believe they were supposed to lose. He said the Germans spent too much time building perfect tanks and not enough time training crews who could think for themselves and adapt under fire. The German High Command studied Arracourt for months trying to figure out what went wrong, how their superior Panthers had been slaughtered by inferior Shermans. But they never really understood because they were asking the wrong question. They kept trying to find technical explanations. Maybe the American guns were more powerful than reported. Maybe the Panthers' armor had manufacturing defects. Maybe the crews at Arracourt were poorly trained. They couldn't accept the simple truth that their doctrine was outdated and their tanks were being outfought by an enemy they'd underestimated. It wasn't about which tank had thicker armor or a bigger gun. It was about which army had learned how to fight smarter, move faster, and adapt when the plan fell apart. The Americans had learned those lessons in blood through defeats in North Africa and Italy, and by the time they reached France, they'd turned the Sherman from a death trap into a weapon that terrified German tank crews. The psychological impact of Arracourt spread through the German panzer divisions like a disease. Crews who'd felt invincible in their Panthers now approached every engagement with caution and fear, knowing that American Shermans might be hiding anywhere waiting to hit them in the side. German commanders started keeping their Panthers further back from the front lines, using them more defensively, losing the aggressive initiative that had made the panzer forces so effective in the early years of the war. The myth of German armor superiority was dying, and every tanker on both sides could feel it happening. The final numbers from Arracourt tell the whole story better than any report could. American factories built 49,234 Sherman tanks during the war while Germany managed to produce only 6,000 Panthers, and those Panthers spent more time broken down with transmission failures than they did fighting. The Germans had built what they thought was the perfect tank, but the Americans had built enough good tanks and trained enough smart crews that perfection didn't matter. By the end of 1944, the Sherman was the most successful tank in the European theater not because of its specs but because of the system that supported it. The factories that could replace losses overnight, the supply chains that kept them running, the training programs that produced skilled crews, and the tactical doctrine that let those crews fight smart instead of fair. Mashlonik's 6 Panthers in one day became legendary among American tankers. A story that proved what was possible when you had the courage to get close and the skill to make every shot count. His crew stayed together for the rest of the war, fighting through the Battle of the Bulge and into Germany itself. And they survived because they never forgot what Mashlonik taught them that foggy morning at Arracourt. Don't fight the enemy's fight, make them fight yours, and never respect a machine so much that you forget there's a man inside who can make mistakes. That lesson, more than any technical specification or armor thickness chart, was what won the tank war in Europe. Thanks for watching this story from the WW2 Vault. Next week we're covering the day a single American destroyer fought off an entire Japanese fleet and somehow won. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss it.